Okay. Unfortunately, Caleb from Betterment is here. So if there are any technical questions, I get to just defer to him. Um, but yeah, this is a chat about how Betterment or how Flutter transformed our organization at Betterment. Um, my name is Jeremy. I'm an engineering manager on the mobile team here, and I'm here to talk about the impact that Flutter has had. And when I say talk, I mostly mean I'm going to share some GIFs and low quality memes like this one, which I made as a joke for my team and helps show why I'm a manager and not a graphic designer. So tonight, or I guess this morning, I'm going to talk about Betterment's decision to migrate our native iOS and Android applications to Flutter, which is a pretty straightforward statement, but the repercussions of that decision were significant. And I'm up here to talking about them because I hope that the lessons from our journey can be helpful to you or to your organization. So first, it's worth touching on the context and the history that went into that decision. Ultimately, though, this is a talk about the challenges that we face both as individuals and as an organization. And then most importantly, this is about the benefits that we've seen from that investment. So a little bit of, I guess, history kind of about me. This topic happens to be of pretty great personal interest. As an engineer at my last company, I spent a pretty lengthy period of time refactoring a legacy application. Eventually, I created or incorporated 11 different internal frameworks and had to combine functionality from 2 completely separate applications. So that experience, and specifically that experience at that company, led me to create and give a talk in April of 2020 about empathy and legacy code. The funny thing was that the takeaway from that talk was that you should leave things alone. But yet I joined Betterment after they had already decided to use Flutter and replatform. And now I'm here to talk about what a great decision that replatforming to Flutter ended up being. This is a quote from me in March of 2020, which is a fairly extreme position, perhaps. But when you refactor large swaths of code, you're probably going to fuck something up because you lack the context from when it was written or the understanding that developer had, even if that developer was you. I certainly wouldn't be on an island in kind of expressing a distaste for writing things. Joel Spolsky, who created Trello, he was the CEO of Stack Overflow for a decade. He writes about software on his website, Joel on Software. Unsurprisingly, has some words about legacy code. His opinion is that the single worst strategic mistake that any software company can make is to rewrite code from scratch. So you're all saying, wait a minute, Jeremy, you just said replatforming to Flutter was a great decision. You kind of sound like you're full of shit. Well, first of all, if you're thinking that, you're very rude. But second of all, these quotes don't quite encapsulate my message from early last year. So while I did warn against the perils of a large rewrite in 2020, the information on this slide is pretty much taken verbatim from my earlier presentation. And while I'm ready to speak to the benefits of a massive undertaking to replatform Betterment's native iOS and Android applications to a Flutter one, I would be remiss or perhaps even reckless not to preempt that with some words of caution. I mentioned that this was an investment that has paid off for Betterment. And fortunately, there were some very smart people at Betterment who considered these very things before making their decision. So your disclaimer is that you should have the following things. On the business side, you need buy-in, and that means from product, from design, from engineering. This is going to affect everyone in big ways. You need buy-in from leadership, from as many people in your organization as you possibly can. It's inevitable that a change like this will not have universal buy-in, but that's okay. And I'm not here to talk about, consensus building or any of the logistics of a big change like this. But you must have people higher up than you, unless you're the CEO, that can support you and make sure that this initiative will be seen all the way through. You have to make sure that you've got the time, the roadmap space, and the resources to do it. It's hard to give an exact time frame on something of this scale, kind of depending on the size of your application, but you want to make sure that you're not going to get cut off before you can start to see the benefits, because otherwise you'll have wasted a ton of time and money and possibly left yourself in an even worse position than where you started. On the technical side, pretty much two sides of the same coin, but you need to have clear phases and an incremental approach. That's a topic that someone on my team has given before. Hopefully we'll maybe even give to you if you're looking for speakers at your next meetup. But yeah, look, I've already spoiled the ending. Flutter was the right tool for Betterment. It could be the right tool for you, but we live in a world and an industry that is chock full of trade-offs. And some of these pitfalls might not be obvious if you haven't been through something like this. And if you don't want to just take my word for it, VGV, Very Good Ventures, has presumably been through it more than the 2 times I have. VGV has been working with Flutter before it was cool. They help companies build high quality Flutter applications that are built for scale. Betterment started working with VGV when we decided to pilot Flutter. They've continued working with us to this day to help us with our journey. And as much as VGV loves Flutter, they also have some words of caution, which you probably can't make out at this size, but needless to say, Flutter is a tool. And just like any other language or framework, not every tool is right for every job. So you've got some personal backstory, you've got your warning, and I'm going to take you back to 2019 and tell you a little bit about the state of mobile development at Betterment. We had an inconsistent architecture and design patterns. And I don't just mean inconsistent between iOS and Android. We also had inconsistencies within each platform. Beyond the technical inconsistencies, we would find that the same features worked differently across our 2 platforms. That's a challenging reality. Feature development and onboarding can be difficult enough at large organizations, and it's even harder when you have 5 different ways that you could build a feature. I use the example of linting being a powerful tool because it eliminates unimportant decisions. It helps you avoid decision fatigue in your day-to-day. I think uniform architecture is that principle on steroids. It allows your engineers to focus more on more important questions than, how do I build this feature? If there are any Ruby engineers on the Zoom, I apologize. I don't mean any disrespect, but former iOS engineer at Betterment had described our iOS application as one that was built by Ruby engineers. And I don't know exactly what it means, but I know that it is somehow 100% accurate. And it was not a good thing for the way that our native application was built. I think beyond the inconsistent architecture, we just had a great deal of unnecessary complexity, which was built in, and needless to say, that wasn't a good thing. The native developer experience was pretty poor. Long native build times are just a reality, but ours were longer than they could or should have been. And that just is a terrible drain on productivity. It's especially true when you don't have something like hot reload or any ability to verify small changes in something under than like 10 minutes. It's made worse when you aren't set up with an ability to test features in isolation, and when you have a fairly nested feature set. We were losing hours a day for each engineer on our team. Historically, at Betterment, the mobile application lagged behind the web application in terms of functionality. Betterment was exclusively a web-based application when it started. So mobile was 20 yards behind the starting line. And we needed twice as many resources to support an iOS and an Android platform. And we didn't have them. I mentioned that Betterment was making a transition to being mobile first. But the flip side of that is an admission that you haven't made a sufficient investment in your mobile application for your team. So in addition to the woes that I've just enumerated, our engineers had other responsibilities to handle. We had a rather lengthy and manual QA process. We had something which we call on-call, which means for us having an engineer on each team that's available each week to handle incoming questions from customers and bugs. And at the time, that meant 2 engineers on a given week to support iOS and Android platforms. So we had a small team. You add on these responsibilities on top of product and feature development and ongoing maintenance, and things are just not so great. This was a quote in the Flutter pilot and migration document that was going around that summarized a lot of that history. It says, "We need to make this decisive change to help see that mobile development does not become a bottleneck for delivery of our strategic roadmap in 2020 and beyond." The reality I just described is what led Betterment to the decision to investigate cross-platform solutions. We conducted a Flutter pilot with a single feature. Flutter met all of our requirements, and we had confidence that the undertaking would help us get to the future that we wanted to see. We got our business and product and design buy-in. We had time, we had a plan. It kind of completely glosses over what was a lengthy and involved process, but I just want to move on to what it meant. So a quick overview of how and when we did some of this, which I'll break down a bit later. But after the pilot, we started with a training for the entire mobile organization that was held in May 2020. That was a 2-week Flutter bootcamp on Dart, Flutter, Betterment's architectural decisions from our pilot. From there, we started developing new features in Flutter with a single team. That was done so we could support that team and continue to work through any issues without overloading ourselves. Then other teams would kind of continue their native workflows, but once we had enough confidence in the state of our Flutter application, we would have everyone developing new features exclusively in Flutter. And that was a good plan, but there were some real challenges, which I imagine that your team might run into as well with a similar undertaking. Going through a few of the things that really stand out to me. Number one is imposter syndrome. I think that many people in this industry suffer from imposter syndrome on a good day. Well, at Betterment, everyone was new to Flutter. And I had senior engineers with years and years of experience who would say to me almost weekly that they felt like a junior engineer again, that they felt like they were starting from scratch. I think that's certainly understandable given the circumstances, but it's a difficult thing to grapple with when the people that you'd expect to be providing mentorship and support are suddenly in need of a lot more of it for themselves. My response then and now is that learning any subsequent language as an engineer is never as hard as the last one that you've learned. The lessons that we learn in our careers translate and empower us to learn new things. But that perspective doesn't change the fact that this is a real struggle for people. And we had engineers who identified with their respective platforms, either iOS or Android, and they're all of a sudden going to feel like things have been reset to varying degrees. Another major and perhaps the biggest challenge for us was the context switching. All new feature development was happening in Flutter, but we still had a really large native code base that we had to maintain. And that was a reality that we acknowledged up front, but it had a really severe impact. This was a meme that I created when we were working on a migration of a feature to Flutter. That feature was presented from a native view, a native feature. So we were going native to Flutter, and then that Flutter feature had to launch a native feature from Flutter. And that native experience was one of these situations that I alluded to before, where we found out that iOS and Android implementations differed. And something that we expected to be relatively straightforward ended up being just a complete mind-melting experience. The context switching is pretty universally acknowledged as bad as a software engineer. We need time to focus and kind of remain in the same context. get into like a deep flow state. You know, we get pulled away on the job, and that's even more likely and worse when you're trying to learn something new and you just end up straddling multiple worlds between, the native world and the Flutter one, and you're just never quite getting the focus that you'd like or that you need. The next kind of major impact was our roadmap. We were unsurprisingly a lot slower up front. The team was still learning Flutter. We had to build out new components as we went. We ran into limitations of the things that we had already built. And then in addition to that and all the other challenges that I was just talking about, we were looking to increase the scope of every single project. We were coupling new feature work with a migration of an existing feature whenever it was possible. And those feature migrations ended up being awfully challenging. We had little to no product or engineering documentation. We had people who were rebuilding features that they had no part in creating in the first place. And it just ended up being a time and labor intensive process that required a ton of input from product, from engineering, and from design. I think relatedly, we just had to rethink how we collaborated as an organization. The Flutter to native to Flutter example that I just mentioned was a great example. We couldn't make assumptions about how anything worked. We had to break down these like pseudo walls that existed across platforms and just constantly be better communicators as engineers. And we need to be better collaborators and communicators with product and design to help them understand what we were going through. The picture that I've painted may sound rather bleak, but as they say, that the night is always darkest before dawn. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about how that investment has paid off, because it really has. All of the challenges that I've mentioned all improved over time, and I can speak to each of them a bit, but it's worth leading off with the marked improvement to our developer experience. We're saving hours a day by streamlining how we develop features at Betterment. And Flutter isn't the only framework that offers hot reload, but it was a significant improvement in our ability to ship features. And we were also able to create something that we called Launchpad, where we could jump directly into a nested feature, which streamlined how we iterated on something that was in development. We're also, so we did a Flutter using add to app, but we gave ourselves the ability to do kind of like pure Flutter feature development and avoid the long native build times by running our application in what we call standalone mode. In addition to that, our onboarding experience got significantly better. Our Flutter, that 2-week Flutter bootcamp that we had turned into a nice set of onboarding lessons. And just as we get multiples on our engineering hours from working with a cross-platform framework, we also get more from a unified investment in our onboarding documentation. From my perspective as a manager, 2 of the biggest wins are unrelated to the technical or the product side of things. I think the first thing that I've seen in everybody here at Betterment is a ton of personal growth. One, from just going through the challenges of something like this, but also, I'm just a big believer in building T-shaped engineers. Accumulating a breadth of experience to go with depth in certain technologies is something that's important to me. And this migration to Flutter provided a built-in opportunity to focus on that for an entire mobile engineering organization. Beyond having people learn Dart and Flutter, we saw more cross-platform code review. It was often out of necessity, but we all got comfortable being uncomfortable. And as a result, I think we're all better engineers. I don't always get to be very hands-on as a manager, but even I would have to hop in and review some Kotlin or Dart and really just push the limits of what I was comfortable with. One of our Android engineers ended up shipping some really massive changes to our Swift and Objective-C code base because he just had to dive into our iOS application to plan an upcoming project. And this isn't to say that everyone needs to or will become a polyglot, but a migration like this definitely opens up some of those doors to you. Beyond the personal side, we've just also been able to build a stronger mobile team culture. There's always that some level of mobile camaraderie and collaboration that happens between iOS and Android. But the reality is that there's a good amount of siloing that happens. We used to have platform-specific engineering forums, beta testing channels, engineering Slack channels. We've been able to consolidate all that. We've got a weekly mobile engineering forum where we can focus on our Flutter application, and our collaboration is happening across product teams as opposed to across product and platform teams now. We're all in this together, and we're better off for it. And I laid out multiple pain points from 2019, which we've been able to address in meaningful ways. Resourcing, I mean, we've been doing a lot of hiring, which obviously helps. But more than that, we really do get double-ish the output from each engineer on the team when it comes to feature development. And more importantly than that, each engineer's time that has to get devoted to other responsibilities has been effectively halved. Just thinking about the projects that we take on here at Betterment, we used to need a platform lead for iOS, a platform lead for Android. So planning a project meant 2 engineers for whatever the ramp up and investigation time period was. That's now consolidated to a single engineer who also has a better starting point because of our reduced complexity and consistent architecture. And the execution of that project, if it used to take 4 weeks for iOS and Android, that would be 8 engineering weeks. Now it means closer to 2 engineering weeks because we can have those same 2 engineers work collaboratively instead of in parallel. And better than just the reduction in time, it also means that we get to spend more time pairing, we get to spend more time supporting one another, sharing our knowledge, and avoiding the information silos that used to exist. I mentioned on-call before as being a burden on the team. We would have 2 mobile engineers devoted every week. So for a team of 4 engineers, you're on call every other week. But now it's once a month, and it's much less painful. As you might expect, since we just did this migration, we've built a consistent architecture across our features. And instead of having 2 platforms that we need to focus on, all of our energy goes to a single one. Our Flutter application is still relatively immature, so we do plenty of iteration on our solutions as we learn and grow, but we have a much easier time being able to identify the latest and greatest patterns and what needs to be updated, and then coordinating those updates and sharing that information across the entire organization. Context switching, especially after we were able to release our kind of home, like our application starting screen in Flutter. For the most part, our engineers don't have to think about integrating Flutter features into a native application. There's still times when we have to grapple with some of that native foundation or features, but those instances are way less frequent and just much more isolated. I think I also mentioned imposter syndrome being pretty prevalent across engineers on the team, and I'll just say it's back to what I call a normal baseline. New engineers come in knowing that they're embarking on this learning journey and have a pretty clear support system in place. And our existing engineers have had time to learn and grow with our platform. So today we have more time to invest in ongoing maintenance work, platform initiatives to keep driving us forward. And we just see multiples on our investments to things like testing and QA. And we're a larger and more collaborative unit. We've finally given ourselves velocity. We've seen a huge uptick in our ability to ship code, and we've absolutely addressed the bottleneck that was called out in 2019. I kind of glossed over the steps, but just kind of giving you a better breakdown of how we got here. I said that we had made real improvements over time, but we reached what I like to think of as terminal velocity when we got to the point where we could migrate our home screen to Flutter. And that launched at the end of August 2021. So, depending how you slice it, I'd say that in about 15 months, I don't feel like I'm being hyperbolic here, but we completed a total transformation of our mobile engineering organization. The way that we're able to build and release software is unrecognizable to even a year ago. And Betterment is thinking mobile first in a way that both iOS and Android are first-class citizens because of Flutter. We haven't solved all of our problems, and none of this happened overnight, but the challenges that my team and that Betterment are facing today are just different than they were, and frankly feel a little less terrifying. So beyond being more manageable, we have more time to continue to address our challenges head on. Things like our testing pyramid, QA, our release cycle, how we think about building APIs with our full stack partners. There's always going to be challenges to face as an organization grows, and those will evolve over time, but we're in a significantly better position today to be able to address all of those things and get more from each of those investments. And that's largely a result of the impact that Flutter has had on our team. It's kind of an afterthought, since my main concern as a manager is the people on my team, but this new reality has just also made my life much easier. It can hard to scale my time as the team grows, but all of those cross-platform benefits apply to me as well, and I'm able to be more impactful and effective as a manager. I have fewer platforms where I have to understand the product and the technical landscape. It's easier to support one engineer planning a project because it's also focused on a single platform. And then we have half as many conversations with product and design. So everything is just streamlined. Pretty much everything that we do now is less complex. And as a result, we're creating high quality features in a fraction of the time. And we're successfully running ahead of our full stack teams here for the first time in Betterment's existence. And that's pretty much our story. I couldn't speak without doing a shameless plug. So I hope that the present and the future we've built sounds exciting. We have an incredible group of people who are on a mission to make people's lives better. We're hiring a lot. It's unfortunately only for US based remote roles, but if spread the word if you know anyone in the US who's interested in Flutter. But more relevant to you all, I hope that our experience was informative and can be helpful to you or your organization's development. And I'll also give a shout out to our GitHub, because we're trying to do more open source work to help more people take on this, go on this journey with us. We've got a couple of projects out there. I think we've got one more on the way, and hopefully many more after that. So appreciate everyone's time and having me out, and I hope you're able to get something useful out of this.
Well, thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, I find like your talk has been very insightful to me, and I think it will be helpful to many businesses as well. As I mentioned before, like I recently integrated Flutter into our own app. Yeah, I think as you said, like at the moment we have to spend twice the time when we build the native apps, but when we go with Flutter, the time will be reduced to half or even less, and it will be less complex because one person knows everything on both platforms. Yeah, so I think, yeah, I totally understand and can relate. So while we are waiting for questions from the audience and for everyone, so if you have any questions to Jeremy, please click the link in the chat, then you can ask questions there. So I have some questions to Jeremy, so I'll just fire away. So how big is your mobile team?
I'm gonna try and cheat and look at a meeting to tell you the exact number. I want to say we are 25 engineers right now.
Okay, that's huge. Okay, cool. Yeah, so I think you mentioned that like how to collaborate. It was like a question, or I think at one stage it was an issue you have to think about. So how, like, because you are going, say you are doing Flutter now, then potentially one engineer can work on one feature, the other one can work on like another feature. So how do you organize the mobile development work now? Do you say have one dev for one feature, or you have two to collaborate or something like that? Yeah.
So we saw a future that we wanted to get to, where we kind of had mobile teams that were embedded with each. So our application is kind of broken down into different feature sets, which we call domains. And we wanted each kind of domain, each squad, to have web and mobile resources, which just wasn't a place that we could be at back in 2019, the beginning of 2020, but we've gotten to that point. So kind of each team is just an embedded group of both web and mobile engineers, and the size varies, but our kind of like minimum number of mobile engineers that we want to have on any team is 4. And that gives us the ability to kind of often do 2 projects in parallel, but it also just kind of depends on how big of a thing we're working on and what else is going on. But it's just really given us the opportunity to like slow down, do more than just feature development, and just focus on building a stronger foundation and thinking about how we can keep pushing our platform forward.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I have a question like, do you have more devs than you need now? But then I saw that you are still hiring. So I guess like even with Flutter, you still need more people.
I mean, to me, sometimes it feels like it, because mobile used to be the bottleneck, and sometimes now it's like we actually don't have enough back-end resources to keep up with everything that we want to do. So we're still looking to grow the organization, but it's like I said we gave ourselves velocity, and we really did. Like what we're able to accomplish without like feeling stretched is just it's a completely different story.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I'll ask one more question before I take the questions from the audience. So how easy is it to hire like a Flutter dev in the US at the moment?
I to be honest, I think it's hard. We have not hired many engineers who have a Flutter background. We've hired a lot of engineers, but they're all coming from either an iOS or an Android background, and are just open to making that transition to being a Flutter engineer here. So we have had a good level of success in being able to effectively transition people who don't have Flutter experience into being really productive and knowledgeable Flutter engineers.
Okay, cool. So there's one question from the audience. So the question is Betterment using or considering using Dart on the server?
No. We replatformed a Java application to being more Ruby on Rails, and I don't see us getting the support to go through another migration on the back end. So not anytime soon.
Okay, cool.
We're actually we're talking about using it for our interviewing question. I mean, it's definitely something that we'd be interested in, and we see the benefits, but I think change gets harder at larger organizations, and that would be an even bigger shift for where Betterment's at right now.
Yep. So the next question is, has the transition to Flutter impacted the company talent recruitment in any meaningful way? Which changes were you able to notice on this field?
Sorry, can you repeat that one more time?
Yeah,
I want to make sure I'm answering the question.
Yeah, has the transition to Flutter impacted the company talent recruitment in any meaningful way? Which changes were you able to notice on this field?
I want to say yes, but I'm kind of struggling with how. I think that the truth is that it has, everywhere that I've worked, I have seen that it's much harder to hire mobile engineers than full stack, like front end or back end engineers. And I think that's because mobile is a bit of a niche within the world of engineering, and Flutter is now a niche within that niche. It's still a relatively young community, so I think it's hard. And if I'm being honest, I don't know if as an organization, as a recruiting organization, we've figured out how to really effectively like tell our story which requires us to really say how like great Flutter is for us and how engineers are able to go from being an iOS or an Android engineer to a Flutter one. So I think that especially on the recruiting front, we're learning what it means to recruit given our kind of like new reality.